There are moments in sports when a single comment changes the entire conversation around a franchise, not because it was meant to be controversial, not because it was designed to make headlines, but because it accidentally revealed something people have been wondering about for a very long time. Sometimes, an executive steps in front of a microphone believing they're explaining a vision for the future, only to discover later that fans heard something completely different. That's exactly what happened when Indiana Fever president Kelly Krauskopf made a comparison that seemed ordinary on the surface, but quickly became one of the most debated comments surrounding Caitlin Clark and the Fever organization. What started as a routine discussion about building a successful franchise eventually turned into a much larger conversation about priorities, championship urgency, and whether the people running the organization truly understand the once-in-a-generation opportunity sitting right in front of them. Because when you have a player capable of changing television ratings, filling arenas across the country, attracting national attention, and bringing entirely new audiences into a sport, every decision gets examined differently. Every comment carries more weight, and every perceived mistake becomes impossible for fans to ignore. The fascinating part is that this story isn't really about one quote. The quote simply opened the door. What happened afterward is what made people pay attention. As Caitlin Clark's impact on the league continued to grow, so did the questions surrounding Indiana's long-term strategy. Fans weren't just celebrating wins anymore. They were analyzing roster decisions. They were debating front office priorities. They were questioning whether the organization was moving aggressively enough to maximize Clark's championship window while she remains one of the most influential athletes in sports. At the same time, Indiana found itself at the center of nearly every major conversation in women's basketball. Every Fever game became an event. Every Clark performance generated national discussion. Every injury update became headline news. The spotlight surrounding the franchise grew larger than anyone could have imagined just a few years earlier. Yet, as expectations rose, so did concerns about whether the organization was matching the urgency of the moment. For many supporters, this wasn't simply about building a successful team someday. It was about recognizing that opportunities like this rarely come twice. What makes the entire situation so compelling is that reasonable people can look at the exact same events and reach completely different conclusions. Some see a front office trying to build sustainable success rather than chasing short-term headlines. Others see an organization moving too slowly while possessing the most valuable asset in the entire league. Some believe patience is necessary for long-term championships. Others believe every season without a title represents a missed opportunity that can never be recovered. And sitting directly in the middle of all those arguments is Caitlin Clark herself, a player whose arrival transformed not only the Indiana Fever, but the broader landscape of professional women's basketball. Whether it's attendance records, television audiences, merchandise sales, or cultural relevance, her influence has touched nearly every corner of the sport. That reality has created enormous expectations, enormous pressure, and enormous scrutiny for everyone connected to the franchise. And that's why the comment that sparked this debate continues to resonate months later. Because to many fans, it wasn't just a statement about organizational goals, it became a symbol of a larger question that still hasn't been fully answered. Does the Fever front office view this moment the same way their supporters do? Do they see a long-term project that requires patience and careful planning? Or do they recognize that they may already possess the type of superstar who changes the timeline entirely? As injuries, roster moves, expansion draft decisions, and championship expectations all collided over the past year, those questions only became louder. And when you step back and connect all the pieces together, the story becomes far bigger than one executive, one quote, or one press conference. It becomes a story about how organizations respond when they suddenly find themselves responsible for a player capable of altering the future of an entire sport. And the deeper you look into what has happened in Indiana, the harder it becomes to ignore the possibility that the most important decisions are still ahead.
The reason this controversy refused to disappear is surprisingly simple. Kelly Krauskopf wasn't trying to create a controversy at all. She was trying to explain her vision for the future of the Indiana Fever. During a discussion about the organization's direction, she spoke about building something that could last for years rather than relying on short-term success. On the surface, that sounds exactly like what fans should want to hear from an executive. Sustainable winning, long-term relevance, a franchise capable of remaining successful regardless of changing circumstances. But then she made a comparison that immediately changed how many people interpreted everything else she said. Krauskopf explained that she wanted the Fever to become a lasting brand, comparing the organization to Apple. In that moment, she likely believed she was describing stability, consistency, and long-term success. What she may not have anticipated was how quickly fans would connect that comparison to the one player who had already transformed the franchise's entire reality. The reaction wasn't driven by what Krauskopf explicitly said. It was driven by what supporters believed was implied. Because when people hear Apple, they don't simply think about a successful company. They think about the individual who became synonymous with the company's rise. They think about Steve Jobs. They think about a visionary figure whose influence was so significant that separating him from the company's identity became nearly impossible. Fair or unfair, that's where the comparison immediately led many fans. Instead of hearing a discussion about organizational growth, they heard a conversation that seemed to place Caitlin Clark inside a larger corporate strategy, rather than recognizing her as the central force behind the franchise's unprecedented momentum. To those supporters, the distinction mattered enormously. In their minds, Clark wasn't just another star player contributing to a successful organization. She was the reason the organization had suddenly become one of the biggest stories in professional sports. That perception spread rapidly across social media, where every word spoken by executives, coaches, and players is analyzed in extraordinary detail. Fans began revisiting the quote and debating what it revealed about the Fever's internal philosophy. Some defended Krauskopf, arguing that successful franchises must think beyond individual players if they hope to remain relevant for decades. Others viewed the comments very differently. They believed the quote exposed a fundamental misunderstanding of the moment Indiana was experiencing. From their perspective, the Fever were not simply building a brand that happened to include Caitlin Clark. They were benefiting from the arrival of a generational athlete whose impact had already exceeded anything the franchise had experienced in years. The concern wasn't necessarily about the quote itself. The concern was that the quote reflected how the organization's leadership viewed the opportunity in front of them. What made the debate so intense was the timing. Had those comments been made before Clark arrived, few people would have paid attention. Had they been made before the explosion in attendance, ratings, sponsorship interest, and national attention, they likely would have disappeared into the background like countless other executive soundbites. But by the time the quote began circulating widely, everyone had already witnessed what Clark's presence had done for the league. Arenas were selling out. Television audiences were reaching levels few expected. Road games suddenly felt like major events. Every move involving the Fever generated headlines. The scale of that transformation made fans increasingly protective of how Clark was discussed. Any statement that appeared to minimize her importance, even unintentionally, was almost guaranteed to generate strong reactions. The most fascinating aspect of the controversy is that both sides believed they were defending the future of the franchise. Those supporting Krauskopf argued that organizations cannot build lasting success around one individual, regardless of how talented that individual might be. History is filled with teams that became overly dependent on a single star and struggled when circumstances changed. Meanwhile, Clark supporters argued that opportunities like this are extraordinarily rare and should be treated accordingly. Their position was simple. When a player arrives and immediately changes attendance, television ratings, merchandise sales, media coverage, and the public profile of an entire league, ordinary timelines no longer apply. The standard approach to team building may not be enough. The urgency becomes different because the opportunity itself is different.
As the discussion continued, the original quote evolved into something much larger than a business analogy. It became a symbol. For some, it represented smart leadership focused on sustainable growth. For others, it represented a front office that still hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of the moment. And once that perception took hold, every subsequent decision began getting filtered through the same question. Every roster move, every personnel decision, every public statement. Fans started asking whether the organization was acting with the urgency they believed a player like Caitlin Clark deserved. Whether those concerns were justified or not, they became impossible to ignore. Because once supporters begin questioning an organization's priorities, every action becomes evidence in a much larger debate. And as the months passed, something became increasingly clear. The controversy was never really about Apple. It was never really about one analogy or one press conference. It was about what the comparison seemed to reveal regarding how different groups viewed the same player. Fans saw a transformational superstar whose championship window should dictate every major decision. The organization appeared focused on balancing the present with a vision that stretched years into the future. Somewhere between those two perspectives, a tension emerged that would continue following the fever long after the original comments were made. And as more events unfolded throughout the season, that tension only became harder to ignore. To understand why so many fans reacted so strongly to the Apple comparison, you first have to understand what the Indiana Fever looked like before Caitlin Clark arrived. This wasn't a franchise sitting on the edge of contention with national attention already pouring in. This wasn't a team dominating headlines or setting attendance records. For years, the Fever struggled to find relevance in a league becoming increasingly competitive. Winning seasons were rare. National television appearances were limited. Outside of dedicated WNBA followers, casual sports fans had little reason to pay attention to what was happening in Indianapolis. The organization still carried the history of its 2012 championship, but as the years passed, that success felt increasingly distant. New stars emerged elsewhere. Other franchises became the center of league conversations. Meanwhile, Indiana was largely viewed as a rebuilding organization searching for direction. The fan base remained loyal, but the broader sports world had mostly moved on. Then, everything changed in a matter of months. When Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, she didn't arrive with ordinary expectations. Her college career had already become one of the biggest stories in American sports. Millions of people who had never regularly watched women's basketball suddenly knew exactly who she was. Her games at Iowa attracted television audiences that rivaled and sometimes surpassed major professional sporting events. Her shooting range became a social media phenomenon. Her competitiveness generated constant discussion. By the time she entered the draft, Clark wasn't simply a basketball prospect. She was already a cultural event. What nobody knew for certain was whether that attention would follow her to the professional level. History had shown that college popularity doesn't always translate directly to professional success, but almost immediately it became obvious that this situation was different. The impact was visible everywhere. Arenas across the league began experiencing attendance spikes whenever Indiana appeared on the schedule. Teams that rarely sold out games suddenly found themselves dealing with unprecedented ticket demand. Opposing franchises moved games to larger venues in order to accommodate crowds wanting to see Clark play. Television executives who had spent years trying to grow audiences suddenly found themselves watching ratings climb dramatically whenever the Fever appeared on screen. Networks that once treated WNBA broadcasts as secondary programming began giving those games premium visibility. Every week seemed to produce another attendance record, another ratings milestone, or another indication that something fundamentally different was happening. This wasn't simply a talented rookie drawing attention. This was an athlete changing the economic and cultural landscape of an entire league in real time. Perhaps the most remarkable part was that the phenomenon extended far beyond Indiana. Normally, a superstar's popularity primarily benefits their own franchise. Clark's impact was different because it followed her everywhere. Road games became major attractions. Fans wearing Iowa jerseys appeared in cities hundreds of miles away from Indianapolis. Opposing teams benefited financially from her presence. Broadcasters openly discussed the surge in interest she generated. Social media engagement exploded. Merchandise sales reached levels rarely seen before. The conversation surrounding women's basketball expanded beyond traditional audiences and entered mainstream sports coverage on a daily basis. Suddenly, people who had never discussed WNBA standings were debating rookie performances, playoff races, and league storylines. The audience wasn't simply growing, it was transforming.
That transformation is why many supporters reject the idea that Clark should be viewed as just another star player inside a larger organizational plan. From their perspective, she isn't merely contributing to Indiana's growth, she is driving it. The distinction matters because it shapes expectations. Fans who see Clark as a generational force naturally expect the franchise to operate with maximum urgency. Every season becomes precious, every roster decision becomes critical, every missed opportunity feels larger than it otherwise would. That's not necessarily because they believe championships are guaranteed, it's because they believe opportunities like this are extraordinarily rare. Organizations spend decades hoping to draft a player capable of changing their trajectory. Indiana didn't just find one, they found someone many supporters believe has already altered the future of the league itself. What's often overlooked is how quickly the Fever's identity changed after Clark's arrival. Before, conversations about Indiana largely focused on rebuilding and potential. Afterward, conversations shifted toward contention, expectations, and championships. The standard changed almost overnight. Losing games felt different because the spotlight was larger. Winning games felt more significant because more people were watching. Every success generated headlines. Every setback generated debate. The franchise went from operating relatively quietly to becoming one of the most scrutinized organizations in professional basketball. That level of attention creates opportunities, but it also creates pressure. Suddenly, every decision carries consequences that extend far beyond the standings. And that's where the Apple controversy begins making more sense, because once you fully understand what Clark changed, you begin to understand why fans became so protective of how she was discussed. To many supporters, they weren't simply defending a player, they were defending what they viewed as the single greatest opportunity the franchise has received in decades. They had watched attendance rise, they had watched television audiences explode, they had watched the Fever become a national story almost overnight. From their perspective, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark wasn't just helping Indiana become relevant, she had already transformed the organization's position in the sports world. And if that's true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. If one player has already changed so much, what responsibility does the organization have to maximize what comes next? That question would soon become the center of an even larger debate. The frustration directed toward the Fever front office didn't appear overnight. It wasn't the result of a single press conference, one roster move, or one controversial comment. Instead, it built gradually, piece by piece, as expectations surrounding the franchise grew faster than many fans believed the organization was responding. The arrival of Caitlin Clark had fundamentally changed how supporters viewed the future. For years, Fever fans were willing to be patient because rebuilding teams require patience. Development takes time. Young players need experience. Championships rarely happen immediately. But Clark's arrival altered that timeline in the minds of many supporters. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about where the franchise might be in 5 years. It was about what the organization was doing right now to capitalize on one of the most important moments in its history. Every decision started being viewed through a different lens, and that lens was championship urgency. The Apple comparison became a lightning rod because it seemed to confirm fears that had already been developing beneath the surface. Fair or not, many supporters interpreted the comments as evidence that the organization was thinking long-term, while fans were focused on the present. They weren't interested in hearing about 10-year plans. They weren't interested in hearing about future brand growth or organizational sustainability. In their eyes, the Fever had already won the lottery. They already possessed the player capable of attracting elite free agents, filling arenas, generating national media attention, and elevating the franchise's profile beyond anything it had experienced in years.
The question wasn't whether Indiana could become relevant someday. The question was whether they were moving aggressively enough to turn relevance into championships. For many fans, that distinction made all the difference. Social media amplified those concerns dramatically. Every interview, every front office quote, every roster announcement became part of a much larger conversation. Supporters began dissecting organizational decisions with a level of intensity usually reserved for championship contenders. Some questioned whether the Fever were surrounding Clark with enough veteran talent. Others wondered if the roster construction truly matched her style of play. Every loss generated fresh criticism. Every setback reopened debates about the direction of the franchise. Online discussions became increasingly focused on whether the organization was maximizing the opportunity sitting in front of it. And because Clark's popularity extended far beyond traditional Fever fans, those conversations reached audiences that normally would have paid little attention to front office decisions in the WNBA.
What made the situation particularly complicated was that perception often became more powerful than reality. Some criticisms were based on concrete decisions that people could evaluate directly. Others were fueled by assumptions, interpretations, and speculations circulating online. Rumors began spreading about disagreements regarding team-building philosophy. Fans debated whether management fully appreciated Clark's value to the league. Reports and claims surfaced across social media suggesting that certain decisions were being made with long-term business goals in mind rather than immediate championship aspirations. It's important to note that many of those discussions were driven by fan interpretation rather than confirmed information. But in modern sports, perception has a way of creating its own momentum. Once enough people begin questioning an organization's priorities, every action becomes part of the evidence they use to support their argument. The injury concerns only intensified those emotions. When Clark dealt with health setbacks, supporters became even more focused on the concept of a championship window. Suddenly, the future no longer felt limitless. Fans began discussing something they hadn't worried about before: time. Great athletes don't stay at their peak forever. Opportunities can disappear faster than expected. Injuries can change timelines. Competitive landscapes can shift. What once seemed like a decade-long runway suddenly felt less certain. That growing awareness made some supporters increasingly impatient with anything that appeared slow, cautious, or overly focused on the distant future. They wanted urgency because they believed the circumstances demanded urgency. Another factor driving frustration was the feeling that much of the Fever's recent success had been generated organically by Clark's presence rather than through organizational strategy. Fans watched attendance records fall. They watched television ratings rise. They watched veteran players express interest in joining Indiana. They watched the franchise become one of the most discussed teams in professional basketball. To many supporters, it seemed obvious what was driving those developments. Because of that, some began questioning whether the front office deserved credit for the momentum it was enjoying. The argument wasn't that management had done nothing right. The argument was that Clark's influence had become so enormous that the organization now had an obligation to match the scale of what she was creating. Every perceived failure to do so became another source of frustration. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the backlash was that it wasn't coming from people who wanted the Fever to fail. Quite the opposite. The loudest critics were often the most passionate supporters. They believed the franchise was sitting on a historic opportunity and were terrified of seeing it wasted. Their frustration came from expectation, not indifference. They looked at Clark's impact on the league and saw a chance to build something extraordinary. They looked at sold-out arenas, national television audiences, and growing cultural relevance and believed the organization should be operating with maximum urgency. Whether those expectations were realistic is a separate debate, but the intensity of those emotions revealed just how dramatically the standards surrounding the Fever had changed. And as those frustrations continued to grow, another narrative began taking shape around the team. Critics started suggesting that Clark's rise had created tension inside the locker room. Rumors circulated that not everyone was happy with the attention she received. Commentators debated whether jealousy and resentment were becoming issues behind the scenes. The story spread quickly because it seemed to fit the broader narrative of organizational dysfunction that some fans were already building. But what happened next would challenge that assumption entirely, because when people closest to the situation finally began speaking publicly, they painted a picture that looked very different from the one many outsiders had been imagining. For a while, one of the most persistent stories surrounding Caitlin Clark had very little to do with basketball itself. It wasn't about her shooting range, her passing ability, or even the Fever's position in the standings. Instead, it centered on something far more difficult to verify: the idea that her popularity was creating tension inside the locker room. The theory seemed simple enough to make. Clark arrived with unprecedented media attention, endorsement opportunities, sold-out crowds, and non-stop national coverage. Some observers began wondering whether that level of attention could create resentment among teammates or other players around the league. It became one of those narratives that spread quickly because it felt believable to people on the outside. After all, sports history is full of examples where fame and attention disrupted team chemistry. The problem was that very little concrete evidence ever emerged to support the claims being made about Indiana. The speculation gained momentum whenever commentators discussed the Fever's growing spotlight. Some analysts suggested that the extraordinary focus placed on Clark might naturally create challenges inside a team environment. Others pointed to the physical style of play she often faced as evidence that frustration existed throughout the league. Rumors circulated online suggesting that certain players weren't comfortable with the attention imbalance. Social media amplified every interaction, every facial expression, and every post-game moment. Suddenly, ordinary basketball situations were being analyzed as potential signs of deeper issues. Fans and commentators began reading between the lines, searching for clues that might confirm what they already suspected. But there was one major problem with that approach. Most of the people making those claims weren't actually inside the locker room.
As the season progressed, the voices closest to the situation started telling a very different story. Instead of describing division, they described unity. Instead of suggesting resentment, they talked about respect. One of the most notable responses came from players who interacted with Clark every single day, people whose perspective carried far more weight than outside speculation. Rather than supporting the idea of internal conflict, they repeatedly pushed back against it. They described a team that understood exactly how much attention Clark brought to the organization and how much that attention had changed the environment around the franchise. More importantly, they didn't frame that attention as a problem. They framed it as reality. Lexie Hull became one of the most important voices in challenging the narrative. As someone who shared the court and locker room with Clark, Hull had first-hand knowledge of the team dynamic. Her comments painted a picture that looked dramatically different from the one often discussed online. Instead of focusing on jealousy inside Indiana, Hull suggested that much of the tension existed outside the organization. She spoke about the increased attention surrounding the Fever and acknowledged that Clark's arrival had changed the landscape of the league. Her perspective wasn't that teammates were struggling with Clark's popularity, it was that the Fever had become a target because of what Clark represented. That's a very different conversation. One suggests internal dysfunction, the other suggests external pressure. Sophie Cunningham offered another revealing perspective. Having spent time with another franchise before arriving in Indiana, Cunningham was in a unique position to compare environments and experiences. Her comments suggested that conversations about Clark extended far beyond the Fever locker room. According to Cunningham, many players around the league were fully aware of the attention Clark generated and the influence she had on the sport's growing visibility. That awareness didn't necessarily create hostility, but it did create motivation. Teams wanted to beat Indiana. Players wanted to prove themselves against the league's biggest attraction. In other words, much of the intensity surrounding Clark wasn't coming from teammates struggling to accept her popularity, it was coming from opponents determined to challenge it. Then there was Clark herself, whose handling of the situation may have been the most revealing aspect of all. Despite months of rumors, speculation, and endless debate, she consistently refused to fuel the narrative. Whenever questions surfaced about alleged locker room tension, her responses remained measured and calm.
Rather than attacking critics or publicly defending herself, she often seemed almost amused by how much people believed they understood about situations they had never witnessed firsthand. That approach stood in sharp contrast to the dramatic narratives being created around her. While others argued about what was supposedly happening behind closed doors, Clark appeared focused on basketball and the relationships that actually existed inside the organization. The strongest evidence against the locker room narrative didn't come from interviews at all. It came from moments that are difficult to fake. Teammates celebrating together after major victories, players interrupting interviews to join in the excitement, locker room footage showing genuine chemistry rather than carefully staged public relations content. The interactions looked natural because they were natural. The enthusiasm felt authentic because it wasn't being manufactured for cameras. Over time, those moments accumulated into a body of evidence that became increasingly difficult to ignore. If widespread resentment truly existed, it was doing an excellent job of hiding itself during the moments when emotions were most likely to surface. That's not to say every player agreed on everything or that the Fever existed in a perfect world free from disagreement. Every professional team experiences challenges, frustrations, and personality differences. That's normal. What made the Clark situation different was the gap between the narrative and the observable evidence. The more people closest to the team spoke publicly, the harder it became to support the theory that the locker room was falling apart because of her presence. Instead, the picture that emerged suggested a group that largely understood the unique moment they were experiencing together. And once that narrative began collapsing, attention shifted back to a much bigger question. If the real issue wasn't teammate resentment, then what exactly were fans so concerned about? The answer wasn't inside the locker room at all. It was above it. Because while players appeared focused on building chemistry and competing together, supporters were becoming increasingly worried about something they viewed as far more important: whether the organization was doing enough to maximize the years ahead. And that concern would only grow stronger when Clark's season took an unexpected turn. The debate surrounding the Fever's future might have remained largely theoretical if not for one reality that every athlete eventually encounters. Injuries have a way of changing how people think about time. Before Caitlin Clark's injury concerns entered the conversation, many fans viewed Indiana's future as virtually unlimited. She was young, immensely talented, and already changing the league in ways few players ever have. The assumption was simple: there would be plenty of time, plenty of seasons, plenty of opportunities to build the perfect roster around her, plenty of chances to chase championships. But sports history has a habit of punishing those assumptions. The moment injuries become part of the story, even temporarily, people begin looking at the future differently. Suddenly, years no longer feel guaranteed, timelines become less certain, and questions that once seemed premature start feeling urgent.
When Clark's season became disrupted by injury concerns, the conversation around the Fever changed almost immediately. Supporters who had previously focused on attendance records, television ratings, and the broader impact she was having on the sport started discussing something else entirely. They started discussing windows, championship windows, competitive windows, the limited periods of time during which organizations have the best chance to maximize the talents of elite players. It's a concept that exists across every professional sport. Teams spend years trying to create one. The challenge is that nobody ever knows exactly how long a window will remain open. Some last a decade, others close almost as quickly as they open. Injuries are often the reason why. For many fans, Clark's absence served as a reminder that even the most durable athletes are not immune to setbacks. The excitement surrounding her arrival had created a feeling that the future would naturally take care of itself. After all, she was only at the beginning of her professional career. But once health concerns entered the picture, even temporarily, the discussion shifted from possibility to urgency. Supporters began asking tougher questions about roster construction. Was the team deep enough? Were the right veterans in place? Was enough being done to reduce the burden placed on Clark whenever she was on the floor? Could the organization realistically contend for championships without making more aggressive moves? Those questions weren't necessarily new. What changed was the intensity with which they were being asked. Part of the reason the reaction was so strong is because Clark's value to the franchise extends far beyond her statistics. Every team can survive losing points, rebounds, or assists for a stretch of games. Replacing what Clark represents is a completely different challenge. She is simultaneously the face of the franchise, the focal point of national coverage, the player drawing unprecedented attention to the organization, and one of the league's most important stars. When someone carrying that level of responsibility misses time, the impact extends well beyond basketball. Fans are reminded just how much is tied to a single player. That realization can be uncomfortable because it exposes a truth many organizations would rather avoid. No matter how talented the roster becomes, certain players remain irreplaceable. The injury discussion also intensified existing concerns about organizational priorities. Supporters who were already questioning the Fever's long-term approach suddenly felt they had additional evidence supporting their worries. Their argument wasn't necessarily about the injury itself. Injuries happen in sports. No front office can completely prevent them. The concern centered on whether Indiana was moving aggressively enough to maximize the seasons when Clark was healthy and performing at her peak. Every missed game became a reminder that opportunities are finite. Every update about recovery timelines became another reason for fans to demand urgency. The same people who had criticized the Apple comparison now pointed to the injury situation as proof that future success cannot simply be assumed. What's fascinating is how quickly public perception changed. Before the injury concerns, discussions about championships often felt hypothetical. They belonged to the future. There was always another season ahead, another opportunity to improve the roster, another chance to add pieces around Clark. Afterward, the future felt much closer. Fans began viewing every season as valuable rather than automatic. The conversation evolved from "what could this team become" to "how quickly can this team become it?" That shift may seem subtle, but it dramatically changes expectations. Patience becomes harder to sell. Long-term planning becomes harder to celebrate. Every delay feels more significant because people become increasingly aware that elite athletic careers do not last forever. The injury also highlighted something else that had been quietly building beneath the surface. For all the attention placed on Clark's individual accomplishments, many supporters were becoming increasingly focused on team success. The attendance records were impressive, the ratings were historic, the media attention was undeniable. But championships remained the ultimate measurement in professional sports. As Clark's influence continued growing, so did the belief that the organization owed it to her and to itself to pursue titles with maximum determination. The injury concerns didn't create that belief, they simply amplified it. They transformed a long-term conversation into an immediate one. And just as those concerns were reaching their highest point, another development arrived that further fueled questions about the organization's direction. It wasn't an injury, it wasn't a controversial quote, it was a roster decision driven by league expansion, one that was entirely understandable on paper. Yet for many Fever supporters, it seemed to reinforce the same fears they'd been expressing for months. Because when key players began leaving the roster, fans once again found themselves asking whether Indiana was truly operating with a win-now mentality, or whether the organization was still thinking about a future that many believed had already arrived.
Just when the conversation surrounding Caitlin Clark and the Fever was beginning to shift toward urgency, another challenge emerged that reignited many of the same concerns fans had been expressing for months. This time, it wasn't an injury update or a controversial quote from the front office. It was the expansion draft. On paper, there was nothing unusual about it. Expansion is a natural sign of growth for any professional league. New teams need players. Existing franchises inevitably lose pieces they would prefer to keep. Every organization understands the rules long before the process begins. In theory, the losses are simply part of doing business in a growing league. But theory and reality often feel very different when those losses affect a team that believes it is trying to contend for championships. And for many Fever supporters, the expansion draft became another moment that raised uncomfortable questions about whether the organization was maximizing the opportunity in front of it. The departures themselves were not necessarily franchise-altering in isolation. Every roster experiences turnover. Every team loses contributors. Every front office is forced to make difficult decisions about protection lists and long-term planning. Yet, what made this situation resonate so strongly with fans was the timing. Indiana wasn't operating under ordinary circumstances anymore. The Fever had become one of the most closely watched teams in professional basketball. Expectations had changed. The standards had changed. Supporters weren't evaluating roster decisions through the lens of a rebuilding franchise. They were evaluating them through the lens of a team built around one of the most influential athletes in the sport. That difference transformed what might have otherwise been viewed as routine losses into a much larger conversation about priorities. For many fans, the discussion quickly moved beyond the individual players involved. Instead, the expansion draft became symbolic of something bigger. It reopened questions about roster depth, championship readiness, and organizational urgency. Supporters who had already been frustrated by the Apple controversy and concerned about injury timelines saw the departures as another reminder that opportunities can disappear faster than expected. Every player lost represented one less piece available to support a roster that many believed still needed additional help. Whether those concerns were fully justified or not almost became irrelevant. The perception itself was powerful enough to fuel renewed criticism. What made the situation particularly complicated was that there were reasonable arguments on both sides. Defenders of the organization pointed out that expansion drafts are designed to create difficult choices. No team escapes them without sacrifice. Losing players doesn't automatically mean a franchise has failed. Smart organizations adapt, identify replacements, and continue moving forward. That's the practical reality of professional sports. But critics weren't focused solely on practicality. They were focused on timing. They looked at Caitlin Clark's growing influence, the injury concerns that had recently heightened everyone's awareness of championship windows, and the increasing expectations surrounding the franchise. From that perspective, every roster loss felt more significant because the margin for error seemed smaller. The emotional reaction was also amplified by the relationships involved. Fans don't just evaluate players based on statistics. They become attached to personalities, chemistry, and visible connections between teammates. Whenever a player who appears to have strong relationships inside a locker room departs, supporters naturally wonder how those changes might affect the team's future. Social media discussions quickly filled with speculation about what the losses could mean moving forward. Some fans questioned whether enough had been done to preserve continuity. Others wondered if the organization should have approached roster construction differently long before the expansion process even began. Again, much of this was driven by interpretation rather than confirmed evidence, but in an environment already filled with skepticism, every development became part of a larger narrative of leadership and vision. What made the backlash especially revealing was that it highlighted how dramatically expectations surrounding Indiana had evolved. A few years ago, discussions about losing role players in an expansion draft likely would have generated limited national attention. Now, those same decisions were being analyzed by fans, commentators, and media outlets across the basketball world. That's what happens when a franchise becomes one of the central stories in a sport. Ordinary roster moves stop feeling ordinary. Every transaction becomes part of a broader evaluation of leadership and vision. Every decision is measured against the ultimate question: does this move bring the team closer to a championship? The irony is that the expansion draft may have exposed the exact tension that had been driving much of the debate from the beginning. Front offices are often forced to think years ahead. They must balance immediate competitiveness with long-term flexibility. They must prepare for possibilities that fans can't always see. Supporters, on the other hand, tend to focus on the opportunity directly in front of them. And in Indiana's case, that opportunity has a name: Caitlin Clark. Many fans simply don't want to hear about long-term sacrifices when they believe the franchise already possesses a player capable of changing everything. They want aggression. They want urgency. They want evidence that every decision is being made with one objective above all others: winning as much as possible while Clark is the center of the basketball universe. As the dust settled from the expansion draft, one reality became impossible to ignore. The Fever still possessed something every franchise in the league desperately wanted. They still had the player attracting record audiences, generating unprecedented attention, and turning Indiana into one of the most desirable destinations in women's basketball. In fact, despite all the controversy, criticism, and uncertainty, something remarkable was beginning to happen behind the scenes. Players around the league weren't avoiding Indiana, they were actively looking for ways to join it. And that development would reveal perhaps the biggest contradiction in this entire story.